psychological meaning of emptiness. Human beings often describe a persistent sense of emptiness. Yet in psychology, this term does not refer to a single emotion. Instead, emptiness is understood as a subjective state marked by low emotional clarity, reduced motivation, and a weakened sense of personal meaning. Research in affective psychology shows that emotions normally function as signals, indicating needs, values, or goals. Emptiness emerges when these signals are muted or difficult to interpret, leaving individuals aware that something is missing without being able to name it precisely. Clinical psychology distinguishes emptiness from sadness or depression. While sadness involves a recognizable emotional tone, emptiness is characterized by emotional flatness or internal silence. Studies using self-report measures and clinical interviews have consistently found that people who report chronic emptiness often struggle to identify their feelings, a trait known as alexithymia. This difficulty does not imply emotional absence, but rather impaired emotional awareness. From a cognitive perspective, emptiness is linked to disruptions in meaning-making. Humans rely on internal narratives to organize experiences into a coherent sense of self. When these narratives weaken due to loss, major life transitions, or prolonged stress, individuals may experience a gap between actions and internal values. This gap is often reported as emptiness rather than distress, because the person cannot clearly identify what has been lost. Neuroscientific research supports this view. Brain imaging studies suggest that meaning and emotional integration involve networks connecting the prefrontal cortex, limbic system, and default mode network. Reduced coordination in these systems has been associated with diminished emotional resonance and self-referential processing. Importantly, this does not indicate brain damage, but rather altered patterns of activation shaped by experience. Psychology therefore treats emptiness not as a mystery emotion, but as a signal of disrupted emotional processing and weakened personal meaning. It reflects how human cognition depends not only on feeling emotions, but on understanding and integrating them into a stable sense of self. Emotional numbing and the brain's regulation systems. One of the most studied contributors to emptiness is emotional numbing. Emotional numbing refers to a reduced intensity of both positive and negative emotions, and it has been extensively documented in trauma research, stress psychology, and affective neuroscience. Rather than a failure of emotion, numbing is understood as an adaptive regulatory response that becomes maladaptive when it persists. The brain's emotion regulation systems are designed to maintain stability. When exposure to stress is frequent or prolonged, the nervous system may reduce emotional responsiveness to prevent overload. Research shows that chronic activation of the stress response system, particularly the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, can blunt emotional reactivity over time. This blunting affects not only distressing emotions, but also pleasure and interest. Neuroimaging studies have found that emotional numbing is associated with reduced activity in the amygdala during emotional processing, alongside increased regulatory control from prefrontal regions. This pattern suggests that the brain is actively suppressing emotional signals rather than failing to generate them. Subjectively, this suppression is often experienced as emptiness. Importantly, emotional numbing does not require extreme trauma. Long-term workplace stress, caregiving burden, or sustained uncertainty can produce similar regulatory patterns. Psychology recognizes this as an allostatic process, where systems designed for short-term adaptation become strained under chronic demand. Behaviorally, emotional numbing alters motivation. Dopamine pathways involved in reward anticipation show reduced responsiveness when emotional engagement is suppressed. As a result, activities that were once meaningful may feel neutral or hollow, reinforcing the perception of emptiness. From a scientific standpoint, emptiness linked to emotional numbing reflects a protective mechanism that has outlasted its usefulness. The brain, attempting to preserve stability, dampens emotional experience, leaving the individual with awareness but little emotional color. Loss of meaning and the collapse of cognitive frameworks. Humans rely on cognitive frameworks to interpret their lives. These frameworks include beliefs about purpose, identity, and continuity over time. Psychological research shows that when these frameworks weaken or collapse, individuals frequently report feelings of emptiness rather than overt distress. This phenomenon has been extensively studied in existential psychology and cognitive science. Meaning is not an abstract concept in psychology. It is a cognitive structure. Studies demonstrate that people who perceive their lives as meaningful show greater psychological coherence, emotional regulation, and resilience. Meaning helps integrate experiences into a narrative that explains why actions matter. When this integration fails, experiences may feel disconnected, leading to a sense of internal void. Major life transitions, such as career disruption, loss of social roles, or cultural displacement, can destabilize meaning frameworks. Cognitive research indicates that when identity-related schemas are disrupted, the brain struggles to predict outcomes and assign value. This predictive uncertainty often manifests subjectively as emptiness rather than anxiety, particularly when the disruption is prolonged. Neuroscientifically, meaning-making involves the default mode network, a system associated with self-referential thought and autobiographical memory. Reduced coherence in this network has been linked to diminished sense of self-continuity. When individuals cannot easily connect past, present, and future selves, they may feel present but unanchored. Importantly, psychology does not treat emptiness in this context as a philosophical abstraction. It is a measurable outcome associated with weakened cognitive integration. Surveys and longitudinal studies consistently show that perceived meaning predicts emotional vitality more strongly than momentary pleasure. Emptiness arising from loss of meaning reflects a cognitive system lacking organizing principles. The mind continues to function, but without a clear framework to assign significance, subjective experience becomes hollow and unstructured. Social disconnection and the need for psychological belonging. Human beings are inherently social, and psychological research consistently shows that a sense of belonging is fundamental to emotional well-being. When social connection weakens, people often report emptiness rather than loneliness. This distinction is important. Loneliness involves the awareness of missing relationships, while emptiness reflects a deeper erosion of social meaning. Social neuroscience has identified specific brain systems that process social inclusion and exclusion. The anterior cingulate cortex and related networks respond to perceived social rejection in ways similar to physical pain. When social disconnection is prolonged, these systems may reduce responsiveness, contributing to emotional blunting and a sense of inner void. Studies in developmental psychology show that early social experiences shape expectations about connection and safety. However, emptiness related to social disconnection is not limited to early life. Adult experiences such as superficial interaction, role-based relationships, or digital communication without emotional depth can also diminish felt belonging. Importantly, emptiness can occur even when people are socially surrounded. Research indicates that perceived authenticity in relationships is more predictive of emotional fulfillment than the number of social contacts. When interactions lack emotional reciprocity or personal significance, the brain does not register them as meaningful connection. From a cognitive perspective, social belonging supports identity. Social roles help define who a person is and where they fit. When these roles weaken or feel interchangeable, identity coherence suffers. This loss of social grounding often manifests as emptiness rather than sadness, because the individual cannot identify a specific loss. Psychology therefore understands emptiness linked to social disconnection as the absence of psychologically meaningful bonds, not merely physical isolation. The human mind requires connection that confirms identity and value. Without it, internal experience becomes muted and hollow. Dopamine, motivation, and the experience of inner flatness. Motivation plays a critical role in how humans experience emotional fullness. Neuroscience has shown that motivation is closely tied to dopamine systems in the brain, particularly pathways connecting the midbrain to the prefrontal cortex and striatum. When these systems function optimally, they support anticipation, curiosity, and engagement. When they are underactive, individuals often describe emptiness. Contrary to popular belief, dopamine is not a pleasure chemical. Research demonstrates that dopamine primarily supports motivation and reward prediction rather than enjoyment itself. When dopamine signaling is reduced, people may still perform daily tasks, but feel no internal drive or sense of significance. This state is frequently reported as emotional flatness or emptiness. Chronic stress, monotony, and lack of novelty have all been shown to reduce dopamine responsiveness over time. Behavioral neuroscience studies indicate that environments with limited variation or perceived agency lead to decreased motivational signaling. As a result, actions feel mechanical rather than meaningful. Clinical research further supports this link. Condi. Tions associated with reduced dopaminergic activity, such as certain depressive states, are often characterized by anhedonia and motivational emptiness rather than persistent sadness. Importantly, this does not imply a permanent deficit, but a functional reduction shaped by experience and context. Cognitively, motivation provides direction. When motivational signals weaken, individuals may struggle to prioritize goals or feel invested in outcomes. This lack of internal direction often manifests as a sense of inner emptiness, because effort is no longer accompanied by psychological reward. From a scientific standpoint, emptiness related to motivation reflects a system that is operational but disengaged. The brain continues to regulate behavior, but without the motivational signals that normally give experience a sense of depth and purpose. Attachment systems and the experience of inner absence. Attachment theory provides a well-established framework for understanding how humans regulate emotional security. Originally developed through developmental psychology, attachment research has expanded into adult emotional functioning and neuroscience. When attachment systems are disrupted or remain chronically unfulfilled, individuals often report emptiness rather than overt distress. Attachment systems are designed to create a stable sense of safety through close relationships. Secure attachment allows emotional signals to be regulated through trust and connection. In contrast, insecure attachment patterns particularly avoidant attachment, are associated with emotional suppression and reduced reliance on others. Longitudinal studies show that individuals with avoidant attachment frequently describe feeling nothing rather than feeling distressed, especially in emotionally significant situations. Neuroscientific research supports this pattern. Avoidant attachment has been associated with reduced activation in brain regions involved in emotional salience, alongside increased regulatory control. This configuration reflects a learned strategy of emotional distancing. While effective for maintaining autonomy, it often reduces emotional richness and contributes to subjective emptiness. Importantly, attachment-related emptiness is not limited to romantic relationships. Attachment systems influence how individuals relate to communities, institutions, and even abstract sources of security. When these systems lack reliable emotional grounding, the internal experience becomes flattened. From a cognitive standpoint, attachment provides emotional feedback that confirms one's significance to others. When this feedback is absent or devalued, emotional signals lose clarity. The person remains cognitively functional but emotionally understimulated, resulting in a sense of inner absence. Psychology therefore understands attachment-related emptiness as the outcome of long-standing emotional regulation strategies. These strategies reduce vulnerability, but also limit emotional depth, leaving individuals psychologically intact, yet internally hollow. Fragmentation of the self and identity discontinuity. A coherent sense of self depends on the integration of experiences into a stable identity. Psychological research shows that when this integration weakens, individuals often experience emptiness rather than confusion or distress. This phenomenon has been studied extensively in personality psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Identity coherence allows individuals to recognize continuity across time. When self-concept becomes fragmented due to conflicting roles, chronic self-monitoring, or external pressure, this continuity erodes. Research indicates that people who frequently shift behavior to meet external expectations report lower internal clarity and increased feelings of emptiness. Neuroscientific studies suggest that identity coherence involves coordination between memory systems and self-referential processing networks. Disruptions in these networks reduce the brain's ability to link current experiences to a stable self-representation. As a result, experiences feel detached rather than personally meaningful. Importantly, identity fragmentation does not necessarily involve dramatic life changes. Gradual role accumulation, such as balancing professional, social, and digital identities, can strain self-integration. When no single identity feels central, individuals may feel present, but internally diffuse. Cognitive research also shows that excessive self-evaluation weakens identity stability. Constant comparison and performance monitoring shift attention away from internal states toward external validation. Over time, this reduces emotional resonance and contributes to emptiness. Psychology treats identity-related emptiness as a structural issue rather than an emotional deficit. The self remains active, but without a clear organizing core, subjective experience loses depth and coherence. Attentional depletion and reduced emotional presence. Attention plays a critical role in emotional experience. Cognitive psychology demonstrates that emotions require attentional resources to be fully processed. When attention is chronically fragmented or depleted, emotional experience becomes shallow, often described as emptiness. Modern environments demand sustained, divided attention. Experimental studies show that frequent task switching reduces the brain's capacity for deep processing. This effect extends beyond cognition into emotion, as emotional signals require sustained focus to be interpreted and integrated. Neuroscientific research indicates that attentional control networks overlap with emotional processing systems. When attentional resources are consistently overextended, emotional signals may fail to reach conscious awareness. The result is not emotional absence, but reduced emotional presence. Importantly, attentional depletion does not always feel like fatigue. Many individuals remain mentally active while experiencing a lack of emotional engagement. This mismatch contributes to the subjective experience of emptiness. Behavioral studies further show that sustained distraction reduces reward sensitivity. Activities lose their emotional impact, not because they are unimportant, but because attention never fully settles on them. Over time, this produces a generalized sense of inner flatness. Psychology therefore recognizes attentional depletion as a contributor to emptiness. When attention is continually dispersed, emotional life becomes muted, leaving awareness intact but internally unfilled. Hedonic adaptation and the fading of emotional contrast. Hedonic adaptation refers to the brain's tendency to return to a baseline level of emotional response following repeated exposure to the same stimuli. This process is well documented in behavioral psychology and neuroscience. While adaptive, hedonic adaptation can contribute to feelings of emptiness over time. Emotional systems are designed to respond strongly to change rather than stability. When environments, routines, or rewards become predictable, emotional contrast diminishes. Studies show that repeated exposure to pleasurable stimuli reduces neural responsiveness in reward-related regions. Importantly, hedonic adaptation affects both positive and negative experiences. Emotional intensity fades as the brain recalibrates expectations. When much of life becomes predictable, emotional experience may feel muted rather than satisfying. From a cognitive perspective, meaning often depends on contrast. Without variation, experiences lose salience. This loss is frequently interpreted subjectively as emptiness, even when external circumstances remain favorable. Psychology does not view hedonic adaptation as a failure. It is a regulatory mechanism that prevents emotional overload. However, when combined with monotony and low novelty, it reduces emotional richness. Emptiness arising from hedonic adaptation reflects a nervous system optimized for efficiency rather than engagement. The mind remains stable, but emotional depth gradually thins. Cultural contexts and the internalization of emptiness. Cultural psychology shows that emotional experience is shaped by social norms and values. Feelings of emptiness are not solely individual phenomena. They are influenced by cultural expectations surrounding success, identity, and emotional expression. Research indicates that cultures emphasizing constant productivity and self-optimization often devalue internal states that are not immediately functional. Over time, individuals may learn to suppress emotional reflection, weakening emotional awareness and increasing emptiness. Cross-cultural studies also show that societies with fragmented social structures report higher levels of internal disconnection. When communal identity weakens, individuals rely more heavily on personal achievement for self-definition. This reliance often fails to provide emotional continuity. Importantly, cultural narratives shape how emotions are labeled. In some contexts, emptiness becomes the default descriptor for diffuse psychological discomfort. This does not invalidate the experience, but reflects learned emotional categorization. Neuroscience supports the role of cultural learning in emotional processing. Repeated reinforcement of certain values shapes attentional priorities and emotional interpretation. Over time, this influences how emotional signals are processed and felt. Psychology therefore understands emptiness as partially culturally constructed. It emerges not only from individual mechanisms, but from the interaction between brain, mind, and social context. Interoception and the diminishing sense of inner signal. Interoception refers to the brain's ability to perceive internal bodily states, such as heartbeat, breathing, and visceral sensations. Cognitive neuroscience has shown that interoception is foundational to emotional awareness. When interoceptive accuracy or attention is reduced, emotional experience often becomes vague or absent, contributing to feelings of emptiness. Emotions are not generated solely in the brain. They are constructed through the interpretation of bodily signals. Research demonstrates that individuals with lower interoceptive awareness report difficulty identifying emotions and reduced emotional intensity. This does not reflect emotional deficiency, but weakened access to physiological cues that give emotions substance. Neuroimaging studies identify the insular cortex as a key hub for interoceptive processing. Reduced activation or connectivity in this region has been associated with emotional blunting and depersonalization. Importantly, these changes are functional rather than structural, shaped by attention patterns and learning. Modern lifestyles often discourage interoceptive attention. Sustained external focus, sedentary behavior, and constant cognitive engagement reduce awareness of internal states. Over time, the brain prioritizes external information, weakening the feedback loop between body and emotion. Behavioral studies further show that when bodily signals are ignored or misinterpreted, emotional responses lose specificity. Instead of distinct feelings, individuals report generalized emptiness or neutrality. This reflects low emotional granularity driven by diminished bodily input. Psychology understands interoceptive-related emptiness as a perceptual gap. The emotional system remains active, but its primary data source is underattended. Without clear bodily signals, emotions lose texture, leaving subjective experience internally sparse. Emotional granularity and the loss of psychological detail. Emotional granularity refers to the ability to differentiate between specific emotional states. Psychological research consistently shows that individuals with low emotional granularity are more likely to describe their internal state as empty rather than emotionally complex. High emotional granularity allows the brain to match experiences with precise emotional labels. This precision supports affective regulation and meaning-making. In contrast, low granularity compresses emotional experience into broad categories, often described as nothing or flat. Neuroscientific studies suggest that emotional granularity depends on the integration of language, memory, and affective processing networks. When this integration weakens, emotional distinctions blur. The individual may experience arousal without clear interpretation, resulting in emotional ambiguity. Importantly, low granularity is not a personality flaw. It is shaped by learning, attention, and social reinforcement. Environments that discourage emotional articulation reduce opportunities to refine emotional categories, limiting internal differentiation. Experimental research shows that people with lower granularity experience emotions as more intense when they do occur, yet report longer periods of emptiness between episodes. This pattern reflects inefficient emotional processing rather than emotional absence. Cognitively, emotional granularity provides psychological texture. Without it, internal experience lacks detail, much like an image with low resolution. Emptiness in this context reflects reduced informational richness, not emotional shutdown. Psychology therefore treats emptiness related to low granularity as a representational issue. Emotions are present, but insufficiently differentiated to be consciously meaningful. Sense of agency and the erosion of internal ownership. A sense of agency refers to the perception that one's actions are self-directed and consequential. Cognitive psychology shows that when agency weakens, individuals often report emptiness rather than helplessness or distress. Agency depends on the brain's ability to link intention, action, and outcome. When this link becomes unreliable due to repeated external control, rigid routines, or unpredictable environments, the sense of internal authorship diminishes. Neuroscientific research indicates that agency involves coordination between motor planning regions and predictive processing systems. When predictions about outcomes consistently fail or feel irrelevant, the brain reduces investment in intention formation. Actions continue, but without felt ownership. Behavioral studies demonstrate that low agency reduces emotional engagement. When outcomes feel disconnected from personal intention, emotional responses weaken. Over time, this produces a subjective sense of inner vacancy. Importantly, agency loss does not require overt oppression or failure. Subtle experiences of automation, excessive monitoring, or lack of meaningful choice can erode agency gradually. Psychology understands agency-related emptiness as a motivational and perceptual shift. The individual remains active, but without the internal signal that actions originate from the self. Experience becomes functional, yet internally hollow. Expirai, anteel avoidance, and the narrowing of inner life. Experiential avoidance refers to the tendency to suppress or escape internal experiences, including thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations. Psychological research shows that chronic avoidance reduces emotional range and contributes to emptiness. Avoidance strategies are initially protective, reducing exposure to discomfort. However, longitudinal studies indicate that persistent avoidance limits emotional learning. When internal experiences are consistently bypassed, emotional awareness narrows. Neuroscientific findings suggest that avoidance involves increased top-down control over emotional processing regions. This control reduces emotional intensity, but also dampens positive affect, producing a flattened internal landscape. Importantly, avoidance does not eliminate emotion. It reduces conscious access to it. As a result, individuals may report feeling empty while physiological responses remain intact. Behavioral evidence shows that avoidance predicts reduced life satisfaction and diminished sense of meaning. The absence of emotional engagement leads to experiential thinning rather than emotional peace. Psychology therefore conceptualizes avoidance-related emptiness as the cost of prolonged emotional distancing. By minimizing discomfort, the mind also minimizes depth, leaving experience internally constrained. Inflammation, neurochemistry, and emotional vitality. Emerging research in psychoneuroimmunology has identified links between low-grade inflammation and emotional experience. While still an active area of study, there is consistent evidence that inflammatory signaling influences mood and motivation. Inflammatory cytokines affect neurotransmitter systems involved in reward and energy regulation. Studies show that increased inflammatory markers are associated with reduced dopamine availability and diminished motivation, often reported subjectively as emptiness. Importantly, this process does not produce classic sadness. Instead, individuals report low emotional drive, reduced interest, and internal flatness. These patterns have been observed in both clinical and non-clinical populations. Neuroscientific research suggests that inflammation alters communication between the immune system and the brain, shifting neural priorities toward energy conservation. Emotional engagement becomes secondary, reducing experiential richness. Psychology approaches this phenomenon cautiously, emphasizing interaction rather than causation. Inflammation interacts with stress, sleep, and behavior, shaping emotional vitality over time. Emptiness linked to neurochemical shifts reflects a system oriented toward preservation rather than engagement. The mind remains alert, but emotional depth recedes as biological resources are redirected. This perspective reinforces a central theme. Emptiness is not a single failure, but the cumulative effect of multiple systems prioritizing stability over richness. Predictive processing and the absence of emotional surprise. Contemporary neuroscience increasingly describes the brain as a predictive system. According to predictive processing models, the brain continuously generates expectations about the world and updates them based on incoming information. Emotional experience arises when predictions are confirmed, violated, or refined. When prediction errors diminish, emotional life often becomes flattened, contributing to emptiness. Emotions are closely tied to surprise and learning. Studies show that emotional salience increases when outcomes deviate from expectation. When environments become overly predictable, the brain reduces the weight of emotional signaling. This reduction is not a failure of emotion, but a recalibration of cognitive resources. Neuroimaging research indicates that prediction error signals involve dopaminergic and cortical networks that also support curiosity and engagement. When prediction errors are rare or trivial, these networks reduce activity. Subjectively, experience feels stable, but emotionally thin. Importantly, predictability does not require monotony. Highly structured lives with constant optimization and planning can also reduce uncertainty. When outcomes are tightly controlled, the brain has little reason to generate emotional amplification. Cognitively, predictive saturation leads to diminished emotional contrast. Experiences are anticipated before they occur, limiting their impact. Over time, individuals may report emptiness despite high functionality. Psychology therefore understands emptiness here as a byproduct of cognitive efficiency. The brain minimizes surprise to conserve energy, but in doing so, reduces emotional depth, temporal disconnection, and the shrinking psychological present. Human experience unfolds across time, integrating past memory, present awareness, and future anticipation. Psychological research shows that when this temporal integration weakens, individuals often experience emptiness rather than distress. Temporal integration allows experiences to feel consequential. Studies demonstrate that people who maintain strong connections between past identity and future goals report greater emotional vitality. When these links weaken, the present moment becomes isolated and emotionally thin. Neuroscientifically, temporal integration relies on coordinated activity within memory and default mode networks. Disruptions in this coordination reduce the sense of continuity. Experiences feel immediate but lack personal weight. Importantly, temporal disconnection is not the same as living in the present. Research distinguishes mindful presence from temporal collapse. In temporal collapse, the present lacks narrative context, leading to emotional neutrality rather than clarity. Behavioral evidence shows that individuals under chronic time pressure often experience reduced future-oriented thinking. Without anticipation, motivation weakens and emotional engagement declines. Psychology conceptualizes emptiness here as the loss of temporal depth. The mind remains aware, but without a sense of trajectory. Experience feels suspended and internally sparse. Value misalignment and cognitive dissonance silencing emotion. Values guide attention, motivation, and emotional response. Cognitive psychology shows that when behavior consistently conflicts with internal values, emotional systems may reduce signaling rather than escalate distress. This reduction occurs through dissonance regulation. When discrepancies persist without resolution, the brain dampens emotional feedback to maintain psychological stability. Over time, this dampening produces emptiness. Neuroscientific studies suggest that unresolved dissonance increases cognitive load in prefrontal regions. To compensate, emotional salience is reduced. Actions continue, but without emotional reinforcement. Importantly, value misalignment does not always produce guilt or anxiety. When misalignment becomes normalized, emotional signaling fades. Individuals may report feeling empty without clear dissatisfaction. Behavioral research indicates that value clarity predicts emotional engagement. When values are unclear or overridden, motivation weakens, and experience loses depth. Psychology understands this form of emptiness as adaptive suppression. Emotional silence prevents chronic internal conflict, but at the cost of vitality, social comparison, and the erosion of internal reference. Humans evaluate themselves using internal and external standards. Social psychology shows that excessive reliance on external comparison weakens internal reference points, contributing to emptiness. When self-evaluation depends primarily on comparison, emotional experience becomes contingent rather than intrinsic. Studies demonstrate that frequent comparison reduces self-concept clarity and emotional stability. Neuroscientifically, comparison activates reward and threat systems simultaneously. Over time, this unstable activation pattern reduces baseline emotional engagement. Importantly, comparison does not require envy or dissatisfaction. Even neutral comparison shifts attention outward, reducing sensitivity to internal signals. Behavioral evidence shows that individuals with strong internal reference report richer emotional lives. When internal metrics fade, emotional experience becomes hollow and externally driven. Psychology treats comparison-related emptiness as a loss of internal grounding. The self remains active, but its emotional compass weakens. Cognitive load and the compression of emotional bandwidth. Cognitive load refers to the total mental effort being used at a given time. Research shows that high sustained cognitive load reduces emotional processing capacity, leading to emptiness. Emotional experience requires spare cognitive resources. When attention is consumed by problem solving, monitoring, or constant decision-making, emotional signals receive less processing priority. Neuroscientific studies indicate that high load shifts neural resources toward executive control networks. Emotional processing regions receive reduced activation, not due to dysfunction, but resource allocation. Importantly, cognitive load can be invisible. Many individuals remain productive while emotionally disengaged. This mismatch contributes to emptiness rather than fatigue. Behavioral research shows that reducing unnecessary cognitive demands restores emotional sensitivity. This supports the view that emptiness here reflects bandwidth limitation rather than emotional loss. Psychology conceptualizes this emptiness as compression. Emotional experience is narrowed, not erased, by sustained cognitive demand. Together, these mechanisms reinforce a consistent conclusion. Emptiness is not a single condition, but a predictable outcome of how human systems prioritize stability, efficiency, and control over emotional richness. Memory integration and the fading of emotional continuity. Autobiographical memory plays a central role in emotional life. Psychology shows that emotions gain depth when experiences are integrated into personal memory networks. When this integration weakens, individuals may feel empty despite ongoing activity. Memory integration allows events to be connected to identity and meaning. Research demonstrates that people who recall experiences as part of a coherent life story report stronger emotional resonance. In contrast, fragmented or overgeneral memory is associated with emotional flattening. Neuroscientific studies indicate that memory integration involves interaction between the hippocampus and cortical self-referential networks. When this interaction is reduced, experiences are stored with less contextual richness. They are remembered as facts rather than lived moments. Importantly, memory integration can weaken under chronic stress or high cognitive demand. Stress hormones interfere with memory consolidation, reducing emotional tagging. Over time, experiences feel less personally significant. Behavioral evidence shows that individuals with poor memory specificity often describe their inner life as vague or empty. This reflects not emotional absence, but reduced access to emotionally detailed memories. Psychology understands emptiness here as a continuity gap. Experiences occur, but they do not accumulate into a meaningful emotional history. Without continuity, the present feels disconnected and internally thin. Suppressed curiosity and the decline of exploratory drive. Curiosity is a core motivational system that supports learning and engagement. Cognitive neuroscience shows that curiosity enhances emotional vitality by linking attention, reward, and meaning. When curiosity is suppressed, emptiness often follows. Curiosity activates neural circuits associated with anticipation and reward. Studies demonstrate that curious states increase dopamine signaling and emotional engagement. Without curiosity, experiences lose forward momentum. Importantly, curiosity can be suppressed by environments emphasizing certainty and error avoidance. When exploration is discouraged, the brain reduces exploratory signaling. Over time, this dampens emotional engagement. Behavioral research shows that individuals who perceive limited opportunity for exploration report lower emotional richness. Even routine experiences feel hollow without exploratory framing. Psychology treats curiosity-related emptiness as motivational withdrawal. The mind remains capable, but disengaged from discovery, reducing emotional texture. Learned helplessness and emotional disinvestment. Learned helplessness arises when repeated exposure to uncontrollable outcomes leads individuals to disengage emotionally. Originally studied in behavioral psychology, this phenomenon has been extended to emotional experience. When efforts fail to influence outcomes, emotional investment decreases. Neuroscientific research shows reduced activation in motivation-related circuits under perceived uncontrollability. Importantly, learned helplessness does not always produce despair. In many cases, it produces emotional neutrality. The brain conserves resources by reducing engagement. Behavioral studies indicate that emotional disinvestment protects against frustration, but also reduces satisfaction. Emptiness emerges as a byproduct of disengagement. Psychology conceptualizes this emptiness as strategic withdrawal. The emotional system minimizes cost by reducing investment, resulting in internal flatness. Reduced novelty encoding and emotional desensitization. Novelty encoding allows experiences to stand out emotionally. Neuroscience shows that novel stimuli activate memory and reward systems, enhancing emotional salience. When novelty encoding declines, emptiness may increase. Repeated exposure to similar environments reduces neural responsiveness. The brain prioritizes efficiency, encoding less detail. Emotional impact diminishes accordingly. Importantly, novelty loss does not require boredom. Highly complex but repetitive stimulation can also reduce novelty signaling. Behavioral research shows that novelty sensitivity predicts emotional engagement. When novelty encoding weakens, experiences blur together emotionally. Psychology understands this emptiness as desensitization. Emotional systems adapt to sameness by reducing response intensity. Metacognitive distance and the loss of emotional immediacy. Metacognition refers to thinking about one's own thoughts and feelings, while adaptive, excessive metacognitive distance can reduce emotional immediacy, contributing to emptiness. When individuals observe emotions rather than inhabit them, emotional intensity decreases. Studies show that high self-monitoring reduces affective engagement. Neuroscientifically, metacognitive processing recruits prefrontal control networks that dampen limbic activation. This reduces emotional resonance. Importantly, metacognitive distance is not emotional intelligence. When overused, it prioritizes analysis over experience. Behavioral evidence shows that excessive self-observation correlates with emotional detachment. Emptiness emerges as experience becomes abstract. Psychology treats this emptiness as experiential distancing. The mind remains reflective, but emotional presence recedes, leaving awareness intact, yet internally sparse. Circadian misalignment and emotional flattening. Circadian rhythms regulate not only sleep-wake cycles, but also mood, cognition, and emotional responsiveness. Psychological and neuroscientific research shows that when circadian timing is disrupted, emotional depth diminishes, often manifesting as a sense of emptiness. The suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus orchestrates daily cycles, coordinating hormonal release, alertness, and affective reactivity. Misalignment, caused by irregular schedules, shift work, or chronic exposure to artificial light, reduces synchronization between the brain and body. This desynchronization dampens emotional responsiveness. Studies in chronopsychology indicate that mood variability correlates with circadian stability. Individuals with irregular rhythms report less affective intensity, particularly in positive emotions. Neural imaging suggests reduced connectivity between limbic regions and the prefrontal cortex during circadian misalignment, limiting emotional integration. Importantly, circadian disruption does not always produce overt depression or fatigue. Emotional signals remain present but attenuated, contributing to the subjective experience of emptiness rather than distress. Behavioral research shows that even mild, chronic misalignment reduces reward sensitivity and motivation. Activities that were previously engaging or enjoyable may feel flat or uninteresting, reinforcing internal voids. Psychology therefore conceptualizes circadian-related emptiness as a temporal misalignment between physiological systems and emotional networks. The mind continues to function, but emotional richness is diminished due to desynchronized signaling, suppressed attachment memories, and emotional fading. Attachment theory demonstrates that early relational experiences shape emotional processing. Psychological research indicates that suppressing or repressing attachment-related memories can produce emotional flatness, contributing to chronic emptiness. Repression often occurs as a protective strategy against relational trauma or neglect. While adaptive in childhood, suppression reduces access to core emotional templates, weakening the ability to feel intimacy, trust, or belonging later in life. Neuroimaging studies highlight that suppression of attachment memories involves increased prefrontal inhibitory control over limbic structures. The amygdala's emotional reactivity is attenuated, resulting in blunted emotional responses to both positive and negative relational cues. Importantly, this mechanism operates unconsciously. Individuals may not recall early relational trauma, yet experience chronic internal voids. Emotional life is intact physiologically, but inaccessible consciously. Behavioral evidence shows that suppressed attachment memories correlate with reduced interpersonal engagement and diminished satisfaction in relationships. The experience of emptiness emerges from a failure to connect current interactions with foundational emotional frameworks. Psychology conceptualizes this form of emptiness as an adaptive cost. Emotional protection in the past creates internal detachment in the present, leaving experience functionally stable but internally hollow. Chronic stress and the dampening of affective salience. Chronic stress exerts profound influence on emotional processing. Research in psychoneuroendocrinology shows that prolonged stress exposure dampens affective salience, often producing persistent emptiness rather than acute negative emotion. Sustained activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis elevates cortisol levels, which over time impair limbic prefrontal interactions critical for emotional evaluation. The brain prioritizes regulatory stability over engagement, reducing the intensity of both positive and negative emotions. Studies in stress psychology reveal that individuals exposed to long-term occupational, caregiving, or environmental stress often report emotional flatness. Neuroimaging shows decreased amygdala reactivity and diminished reward network activation, corresponding to reduced emotional depth. Importantly, this effect is gradual and cumulative. Stress does not erase emotion, but reshapes it, favoring safety and homeostasis over experiential richness. Emotional awareness may remain, but the affective quality is muted. Behavioral research indicates that chronic stress reduces responsiveness to meaningful events and diminishes motivation. Individuals continue daily routines, yet internal experience lacks vibrancy, leading to persistent feelings of emptying. As this, psychology treats stress-related emptiness as an adaptive recalibration. The nervous system reduces emotional signaling to protect cognitive and physiological resources, leaving subjective experience functionally intact but emotionally sparse. Neuroplasticity and the narrowing of emotional repertoire. Neuroplasticity allows the brain to adapt to experience by strengthening frequently used pathways and weakening underutilized ones. Cognitive neuroscience shows that emotional pathways can be selectively reinforced or diminished, influencing the breadth of emotional experience. When certain emotional states are consistently neglected, such as curiosity, awe, or playfulness, associated neural circuits weaken. Over time, individuals report less emotional differentiation, which manifests as emptiness rather than transient low mood. Functional MRI studies indicate that repeated engagement with limited emotional contexts reduces activation in limbic prefrontal networks. The brain becomes efficient at processing routine emotional stimuli, but less responsive to novel or nuanced signals. Importantly, this narrowing does not denote permanent deficit. Neural pathways remain modifiable, but habitual patterns shape baseline emotional responsiveness. Behavioral routines that prioritize safety, predictability, or avoidance inadvertently reduce emotional richness. Psychology conceptualizes this type of emptiness as reduced emotional bandwidth. The mind continues to operate normally, but the capacity for varied emotional experience contracts, producing internal flatness. The default mode network and the diminishing sense of self. The default mode network, DMN, is a large-scale brain network implicated in self-referential thought, autobiographical memory, and future planning. Neuroscience research shows that altered DMN connectivity correlates with feelings of emptiness. When DMN activity is hypoactive or dysregulated, integration of internal experiences diminishes. Individuals may perceive events and thoughts, but fail to situate them within a coherent self-narrative, producing emotional detachment. Studies using resting state fMRI reveal that decreased DMN connectivity is associated with diminished self-referential processing and reduced emotional depth. The subjective experience is one of inner vacancy rather than overt distress. Importantly, DMN-related emptiness is not pathological per se. It often reflects adaptive modulation of self-focus, particularly under chronic stress or high cognitive load. However, persistent hypoactivity reduces the sense of personal significance and emotional resonance. Behavioral research shows that individuals with altered DMN function may maintain external functionality while reporting an internal void. Experience continues, but subjective integration and emotional fullness are impaired. Psychology interprets this form of emptiness as the product of diminished self-referential processing. The mind remains alert and competent, but the internal narrative and emotional richness recede, leaving a hollowed subjective experience. The role of oxytocin in emotional connectedness. Oxytocin, often referred to as the social bonding neuropeptide, plays a critical role in affiliative behavior and emotional resonance. Psychological research shows that variations in oxytocin signaling influence perceived social connectedness and, by extension, experiences of emptiness. Oxytocin facilitates the encoding of social reward and the emotional salience of interpersonal interactions. When oxytocin release is reduced or receptor sensitivity is low, social interactions may feel less meaningful, even in supportive contexts. Functional imaging studies reveal attenuated activation in the ventral striatum and amygdala during social engagement under such conditions, reducing emotional intensity. Importantly, diminished oxytocin signaling does not create social incapacity. Individuals can maintain relationships and fulfill social obligations while still experiencing internal flatness. The subjective perception is a muted sense of connection, which manifests as emptiness rather than isolation per se. Environmental factors modulate oxytocin dynamics. Chronic stress, early relational adversity, and prolonged social deprivation can downregulate oxytocin pathways, subtly altering emotional responsiveness. Over time, the individual experiences routine social interactions without the emotional reward normally associated with bonding. Behavioral research corroborates this effect. Low oxytocin activity correlates with reduced trust, intimacy, and perceived social significance. Even pleasurable interactions may feel hollow when emotional resonance is biologically attenuated. Psychology interprets oxytocin-related emptiness as a neurobiological constraint on social affective experience. The mechanisms of bonding remain intact functionally, but the internal emotional feedback loop is weakened, leaving the subjective experience of interpersonal engagement diminished and internally sparse. Attenuated reward sensitivity and the flattening of pleasure. Reward sensitivity, mediated largely by dopaminergic circuits, is central to emotional vitality. Psychological and neuroscientific research shows that when reward pathways respond less robustly to stimuli, emotional experience becomes flattened, producing persistent emptiness. Dopamine supports the anticipation of reward more than the hedonic experience itself. Individuals with attenuated reward sensitivity maintain goal-directed behavior, but often report a lack of internal engagement or excitement. Functional imaging demonstrates reduced striatal activation during reward anticipation in these individuals, reflecting lower motivational signaling. Importantly, reward attenuation can result from both biological and environmental factors. Chronic stress, monotony, and repeated exposure to predictable outcomes reduce neural responsiveness in reward-related circuits. The effect is cumulative, gradually reducing emotional richness. Behavioral studies show that diminished reward sensitivity correlates with lower initiative, reduced curiosity, and a sense of inner void. The person continues daily routines, but engagement lacks depth or personal significance. Cognitive perspectives suggest that reward flattening impairs the brain's predictive coding of meaningful outcomes. Experiences become functionally processed but emotionally muted, contributing to the subjective experience of emptiness. Psychology interprets this form of emptiness as an adaptive recalibration. The nervous system conserves energy by reducing anticipatory signaling, prioritizing efficiency over emotional depth. The mind operates effectively, yet internal vitality is compromised. Chronic uncertainty and the suppression of emotional investment. Uncertainty is a core psychological stressor. Research in cognitive and affective neuroscience shows that prolonged exposure to unpredictable environments reduces emotional investment, often resulting in a pervasive sense of emptiness. When outcomes are consistently ambiguous, the brain's predictive systems struggle to establish reliable models. Studies demonstrate that under chronic uncertainty, prefrontal limbic connectivity shifts toward regulatory control at the expense of emotional salience. Emotional signals are deprioritized to reduce cognitive load, producing internal flatness. Importantly, this mechanism is protective. Suppression of emotional investment prevents constant disappointment or anxiety in unstable contexts. However, the cost is diminished experiential richness, leaving the individual feeling internally hollow despite functional adaptation. Behavioral research indicates that chronic uncertainty reduces engagement with both tasks and relationships. Even meaningful experiences are approached with detachment, as the brain minimizes risk exposure. Psychology understands uncertainty-related emptiness as a strategic recalibration. Emotional systems remain active, but investment is limited to maintain equilibrium, producing a quiet internal void. Alexithymia and the impairment of emotional differentiation. Alexithymia is a trait characterized by difficulty identifying and describing emotions. Psychological research consistently shows that individuals with high alexithymia report persistent emptiness, not because of a lack of emotion, but due to impaired awareness and categorization. Neuroscientific studies indicate reduced functional connectivity between the insula, anterior cingulate cortex, and language processing areas in alexithymic individuals. This weakens the translation of physiological and affective signals into conscious, differentiated emotional experience. Importantly, alexithymia is not synonymous with affective deficiency. Physiological responses remain intact, but the conscious experience of emotion is flattened. Individuals often describe internal states as empty because they lack the granularity to recognize subtle emotional differences. Behavioral evidence supports this phenomenon. Alexithymic individuals may engage in social and professional activities effectively, while experiencing a pervasive internal void. Emotional signals are generated but inaccessible, leaving subjective experience muted. Psychology conceptualizes alexithymia-related emptiness as a perceptual limitation. Emotional depth exists biologically, but the interpretive systems necessary for conscious awareness are underdeveloped or underutilized, producing an internally sparse experience. Over-reliance on abstract cognition and emotional distancing. Humans possess advanced abstract reasoning capabilities, allowing reflection, planning, and analysis. Psychological research shows that excessive reliance on abstract cognition can diminish emotional immediacy, fostering emptiness. Cognitive distancing occurs when thought is dominated by abstraction rather than direct experience. Neuroimaging demonstrates increased prefrontal activation alongside reduced limbic engagement during highly abstract thought, leading to emotional attenuation. Importantly, abstraction is adaptive for problem solving, but can suppress the richness of ongoing experience. Individuals may maintain functional and analytical performance, while internal emotional life becomes muted. Behavioral studies confirm that frequent overengagement in abstract thought correlates with reduced experiential presence and flattened affect. Emptiness arises because reflective processes take precedence over immersive emotional processing. Psychology interprets this form of emptiness as the byproduct of cognitive prioritization. The mind continues to operate efficiently in reasoning and planning domains, but the emotional system is deprioritized, leaving internal experience internally sparse and hollow. Sensory attenuation and the dampening of experiential richness. Sensory processing is foundational to emotional experience. Cognitive neuroscience demonstrates that the intensity and novelty of sensory input shape the depth of emotional engagement. When sensory signals are consistently attenuated through habituation, environmental monotony, or reduced attentional focus, individuals often report feelings of emptiness. The brain constantly filters sensory information, prioritizing novel or salient input. Functional imaging studies show that repeated exposure to similar stimuli reduces activation in sensory cortices and downstream affective networks. Emotional signals associated with routine sensory input become muted, creating an internal flatness despite ongoing perception. Importantly, sensory attenuation does not eliminate awareness. Individuals continue to perceive stimuli and respond functionally, but the affective resonance is weakened. This explains why familiar environments or repetitive routines often feel emotionally hollow over time. Behavioral research supports this mechanism. Individuals exposed to monotonous environments demonstrate lower reward sensitivity, reduced motivation, and a subjective sense of internal emptiness. Even complex stimuli can feel flat if the attentional system fails to fully engage sensory channels. Psychology conceptualizes sensory-related emptiness as a perceptual dampening. The nervous system prioritizes efficiency and predictability over vivid experiential encoding, leaving emotional life intact in function, but diminished in intensity. Interpersonal misattunement and the loss of relational resonance. Human emotional experience is deeply influenced by interpersonal alignment. Psychological research indicates that when individuals experience chronic misattunement, mismatched emotional signals, inconsistent responses, or relational friction, subjective emptiness can emerge. Attunement supports validation, mirroring, and emotional co-regulation. Neuroscience shows that synchronized neural activity occurs during emotionally congruent interactions, enhancing resonance and reinforcing a sense of connection. Persistent misattunement reduces this resonance, attenuating emotional engagement. Importantly, misattunement need not involve overt conflict. Subtle inconsistencies in responsiveness, lack of mutual acknowledgement, or perceived emotional distance can gradually erode relational signaling. The result is diminished internal emotional richness. Behavioral studies indicate that individuals in chronically misattuned environments report lower mood, reduced relational satisfaction, and generalized feelings of emptiness. The mind continues to process social cues, but the affective amplification normally provided by relational attunement is absent. Psychology interprets this emptiness as a relationally mediated phenomenon. Emotional systems remain functional, but the absence of synchronous external reinforcement limits experiential depth. Prolonged mind wandering and emotional disconnection. Mind wandering, the spontaneous shifting of attention away from the immediate environment, is a well-studied cognitive phenomenon. While often adaptive, prolonged or uncontrolled mind wandering can reduce emotional presence, contributing to emptiness. Neuroscience demonstrates that mind wandering engages the default mode network, often at the expense of attention to sensory, social, and affective cues. When internal thought dominates, ongoing experiences are processed abstractly, reducing their emotional salience. Importantly, this process is distinct from reflective thought. Excessive, unguided mind wandering displaces immersion in present experiences. Emotional signals continue physiologically, but fail to reach conscious intensity. Behavioral evidence shows that individuals with frequent mind wandering report diminished engagement, flattened affect, and a generalized sense of inner void. Even pleasurable or meaningful events can feel muted under persistent cognitive drift. Psychology frames this emptiness as attentional. Displacement. The cognitive system remains active and functional, but emotional integration into immediate experience is compromised, producing a hollowed, subjective state. Emotional habituation and the attenuation of response. Repeated exposure to similar emotional stimuli leads to habituation, a process observed across behavioral, cognitive, and neuroscientific studies. Habituation reduces affective responsiveness, producing a subjective sense of emptiness even in emotionally rich contexts. Neuroimaging studies indicate that repeated stimuli elicit decreasing activation in limbic and reward circuits. This reduction is adaptive, preventing overstimulation, but it also diminishes the subjective intensity of emotional experience. Importantly, habituation affects both positive and negative stimuli. Over time, repeated exposure to emotionally similar interactions or events reduces differentiation, leading to flattened affect and diminished internal engagement. Behavioral research confirms that habituated individuals maintain functional emotional responses, yet report a persistent void. Emptiness arises not from absence of emotion, but from attenuated experiential contrast and reduced novelty. Psychology conceptualizes habituation-related emptiness as the cost of neural efficiency. Emotional systems prioritize resource conservation, which maintains stability at the expense of depth and vividness. Integration of multisystem influences on emptiness. By the 40th section, a unifying perspective emerges. Feelings of emptiness result from the cumulative interaction of multiple cognitive, emotional, social, and biological systems. Each mechanism, whether reduced interoception, attenuated reward sensitivity, misattunement, or neural habituation, converges to produce a subjective internal flatness. Psychology views emptiness not as a single deficit, but as a multidimensional phenomenon. Neural, cognitive, and affective networks interact dynamically, modulating emotional intensity, coherence, and salience. Chronic patterns, environmental influences, and individual differences shape the balance of these systems. Neuroscientific evidence highlights that no single brain region or pathway governs emptiness. Rather, it arises from distributed interactions. Prefrontal control, limbic responsiveness, sensory integration, interoception, and social signaling collectively determine the richness of experience. Behavioral research reinforces this integration. Emptiness can manifest across contexts, social, occupational, and personal, even when functional competence remains intact. It reflects a structural pattern of reduced engagement rather than a simple absence of emotion. Psychology thus interprets emptiness as a systemic outcome. Adaptive mechanisms, stress regulation, efficiency optimization, predictive processing, and cognitive control ensure survival and function, but simultaneously constrain emotional richness. The resulting subjective experience is internally sparse, coherent in awareness, yet attenuated in depth. This final perspective emphasizes that emptiness is not failure, pathology, or moral deficit. It is a natural consequence of the brain's balancing act. Maintaining stability, conserving resources, and modulating engagement across overlapping systems, leaving human experience functional, but sometimes internally hollow. Attentional narrowing and the constriction of emotional field. Attention is a gateway to experience, shaping which sensory, cognitive, and emotional signals reach conscious awareness. Research in cognitive psychology demonstrates that when attention is chronically narrowed, either by high cognitive load, environmental monotony, or habitual focus on limited stimuli, emotional experience becomes constrained, contributing to feelings of emptiness. Neuroscientific studies reveal that sustained attentional narrowing reduces activation in the parietal and prefrontal cortices that normally facilitate distributed processing of emotional and sensory input. Simultaneously, limbic regions receive less modulation from attentional networks, diminishing emotional amplification. The result is a reduced subjective field of emotional awareness, in which stimuli are perceived but not fully integrated. Importantly, attentional narrowing is not inherently pathological. It often arises adaptively, allowing the brain to conserve cognitive and emotional resources. However, when maintained chronically, it restricts the diversity of experience, producing a persistent internal flatness. Behavioral research supports this mechanism. Individuals under prolonged focus on repetitive or limited tasks report fewer emotional fluctuations and describe internal states as hollow or internally sparse. Even novel or positive experiences fail to penetrate the narrowed attentional window, leaving emotional richness attenuated. Psychology conceptualizes attentional narrowing as a gating phenomenon. Emotional signals exist, but fail to reach conscious awareness with full intensity. The mind remains operational, attentive, and functional, yet subjective experience lacks vibrancy. This creates an internally constrained emotional landscape where the brain prioritizes efficiency over depth. Overgeneralized thinking and emotional ambiguity. Cognitive psychology identifies overgeneralized thinking, broad, abstract interpretations of events, as a contributor to internal emptiness. When the brain habitually interprets experiences in sweeping, nonspecific terms, emotional signals become less precise, and affective differentiation diminishes. Neuroscientific research suggests that overgeneralized cognition increases prefrontal inhibition over limbic responses, dampening the salience of discrete emotional stimuli. The resulting state produces low emotional granularity, in which experiences are perceived abstractly rather than vividly. Individuals may report internal blankness, even when physiological arousal is present. Importantly, overgeneralization is not equivalent to maladaptive thinking in all contexts. It can facilitate planning and broad perspective taking, but at the cost of reduced affective richness. Habitual abstraction limits the ability to engage with subtle nuances in experience, producing emotional flattening. Behavioral evidence indicates that overgeneralized thinkers often describe life as lacking texture or specificity. Their responses to both rewarding and stressful situations are muted, producing persistent internal emptiness. Emotional engagement is present functionally, but fails to penetrate subjective awareness fully. Psychology interprets overgeneralized thinking as a cognitive mechanism that prioritizes efficiency over experiential depth. While advantageous in decision-making, it reduces emotional discrimination, leaving the subjective sense of internal hollowness intact. Suppressed playfulness and the restriction of emotional flexibility. Play is a core mechanism for learning, emotional exploration, and affective variability. Research in developmental and cognitive psychology demonstrates that suppression of play through social, cultural, or self-imposed constraints limits emotional flexibility and can manifest as internal emptiness in adults. Play engages multiple neural systems simultaneously: dopaminergic reward pathways, prefrontal planning circuits, and limbic affective networks. Reduced engagement in playful activities decreases activation in these circuits, diminishing the emotional richness of everyday experiences. Functional imaging shows that playful engagement correlates with broader connectivity across emotion and reward networks, enhancing vibrancy. Importantly, play suppression need not arise from trauma. Routine adult responsibilities, cultural expectations, and repetitive environments can gradually diminish playful behavior. As flexibility and novelty decrease, the internal emotional palette narrows. Behavioral research confirms that adults with limited playfulness report less spontaneous joy, fewer nuanced emotional reactions, and a persistent sense of internal flatness. Even complex or meaningful events fail to evoke a full spectrum of affective responses. Psychology frames this form of emptiness as adaptive conservatism. By limiting playful engagement, the brain minimizes risk and unpredictability, but sacrifices emotional richness, leaving internal experience functional, yet internally hollow. Habitual suppression of negative emotion and emotional flattening. Emotion regulation often involves suppressing unpleasant feelings. Psychological research shows that habitual suppression of negative emotion, while protective in the short term, reduces overall emotional range and contributes to a persistent sense of emptiness. Neuroscience demonstrates that suppression engages prefrontal inhibitory networks over limbic regions, diminishing activation in the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex. While this reduces the conscious impact of negative stimuli, it also blunts responsiveness to positive or neutral signals, producing generalized internal flattening. Importantly, suppression differs from acceptance or adaptive regulation. Chronic suppression preserves stability but limits affective texture. Individuals maintain functionality but experience reduced emotional nuance. Behavioral studies support this pattern. Habitual suppressors report lower emotional granularity, diminished interpersonal engagement, and persistent internal hollowness. Physiological arousal remains, but conscious emotional experience is muted. Psychology interprets suppression-related emptiness as the trade-off of stability over depth. Internal experience persists, but affective intensity is attenuated, producing a quiet, hollowed internal landscape. Integrative perspective. Emptiness as a multidimensional construct. The preceding 44 sections reveal that emptiness is not a unitary phenomenon, but arises from the convergence of multiple. The cognitive, emotional, social, and neurobiological mechanisms. Each factor, from interoceptive deficits and reward attenuation to attentional narrowing, overgeneralization, and play suppression, interacts dynamically to shape subjective experience. Neuroscience underscores that no single brain region accounts for emptiness. Rather, distributed networks, including the limbic system, prefrontal cortex, default mode network, and sensory cortices, interact with hormonal and neurotransmitter systems to regulate emotional intensity, differentiation, and salience. Disruption or modulation in any of these systems can contribute to a reduced experiential landscape. Behaviorally, emptiness manifests as functional continuity paired with diminished affective richness. Individuals continue daily routines, engage socially, and execute cognitive tasks. Yet internal experience is flattened, temporally sparse, and emotionally underdifferentiated. Psychology conceptualizes emptiness as a systemic outcome. An adaptive recalibration, prioritizing stability, efficiency, and regulation over emotional vibrancy. The phenomenon reflects a balance between survival-oriented mechanisms and experiential richness. In this framework, emptiness is neither moral deficit nor pathology in isolation. It is the emergent product of overlapping cognitive strategies, neural adaptations, social influences, and environmental conditions. While subjective experience is internally sparse, the underlying systems remain active, maintaining functional coherence. Understanding emptiness as multidimensional reframes it not as absence, but as attenuation, a predictable, biologically and psychologically grounded outcome of human complexity. It is a state in which experience persists, internally structured yet reduced in emotional depth, offering insight into the intricate interplay between mind, brain, and environment. Chronic decision fatigue and emotional depletion. Decision-making requires sustained cognitive effort, and prolonged exposure to choices can diminish emotional engagement. Psychological research demonstrates that chronic decision fatigue, arising from repeated demands to evaluate options or regulate behavior, reduces affective responsiveness and contributes to a sense of internal emptiness. Neuroscience indicates that decision fatigue involves prefrontal cortex resource depletion. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and inhibitory control, becomes less efficient over time, reducing its ability to modulate limbic activity. Consequently, emotional responses are attenuated. Experiences continue to be processed cognitively, but affective resonance diminishes. Importantly, decision fatigue does not preclude effective action. Individuals maintain functional competence in tasks requiring attention and judgment, yet emotional depth is compromised. Even rewarding or meaningful outcomes may fail to evoke strong affective responses. Behavioral studies support this relationship, showing that individuals facing high cumulative cognitive load report flattened emotional experience, reduced curiosity, and diminished satisfaction in daily activities. Emotional depletion emerges gradually, reflecting the cumulative effect of continuous cognitive demands. Psychology interprets this form of emptiness as an adaptive cost. The mind prioritizes decision accuracy and cognitive stability over emotional amplification, preserving functional performance while reducing the intensity and richness of subjective experience. Hyperrational processing and the suppression of feeling. Humans often rely on rational analysis to navigate complex situations. While beneficial for problem solving, excessive reliance on hyperrational processing can suppress spontaneous emotional responses, producing a persistent sense of emptiness. Cognitive neuroscience demonstrates that sustained analytical thought recruits prefrontal control systems, which inhibit limbic and subcortical regions associated with emotion. Functional imaging reveals decreased amygdala and ventral striatal activity during prolonged rational deliberation, reflecting attenuated emotional salience. Importantly, hyperrationality does not indicate emotional absence. Emotional systems remain active physiologically, but conscious experience is filtered through layers of analytical evaluation, reducing immediacy and richness. Individuals may perform effectively in work or social contexts while reporting internal hollowing. Behavioral studies indicate that those engaged predominantly in logical or abstract thought exhibit reduced emotional granularity, diminished engagement with interpersonal experiences, and a sense of flatness. Emotional feedback is present but muted, producing emptiness rather than distress. Psychology frames hyperrationality-related emptiness as a functional trade-off. Cognitive efficiency and accuracy are prioritized at the cost of experiential vibrancy. The mind continues to operate effectively, while internal affective experience is selectively dampened. Persistent rumination and emotional saturation. Rumination involves repetitive, often negative, self-focused thought. Psychological research shows that chronic rumination diminishes emotional differentiation and contributes to feelings of emptiness by saturating the mind with undirected cognitive activity. Neuroscience demonstrates that persistent rumination engages the default mode network and prefrontal control regions while suppressing limbic responsiveness. The brain prioritizes internal analysis over immediate emotional experience, producing a flattening of affective signals. Importantly, rumination does not eradicate emotion. Rather, it reallocates attention to repetitive cognitive patterns. Individuals may remain physiologically reactive, but subjectively disconnected from affective nuance. Experiences are processed conceptually rather than emotionally. Behavioral evidence supports this mechanism. Chronic ruminators report reduced emotional satisfaction, diminished response to novelty, and a pervasive internal void. The cognitive system remains active, yet emotional bandwidth is limited, leaving subjective experience hollow. Psychology interprets rumination-related emptiness as an overextension of cognitive focus. The mind maintains functional processing, while emotional salience is suppressed, producing an internally flat experiential landscape, attenuated interoception, and reduced bodily awareness. Interoception, the perception of internal bodily states, contributes to emotional richness. Cognitive neuroscience indicates that reduced interoceptive sensitivity correlates with diminished affective experience, leading to subjective emptiness. The insular cortex integrates signals from the body, shaping emotional awareness. Studies show that individuals with attenuated interoception exhibit decreased insular activation and reduced connectivity with the anterior cingulate and prefrontal cortices. Emotional responses remain, but they lack vivid bodily grounding. Importantly, interoceptive deficits do not prevent functionality. Individuals may perform daily tasks, process social cues, and regulate behavior, yet subjective feeling is muted. The body's contribution to emotional texture is diminished, producing internal flatness. Behavioral research confirms that reduced interoceptive sensitivity correlates with lower affective intensity, blunted emotional memory, and persistent internal emptiness. Experiences are cognitively registered, but lack somatic resonance. Psychology frames interoception-related emptiness as a perceptual attenuation. Emotional signals exist, but are weakly embodied, limiting their subjective impact and producing a quiet, hollow internal state. Neurochemical modulation and the baseline of emotional experience. Neurotransmitter systems, including dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, play a foundational role in setting the baseline of emotional experience. Psychological and neuroscientific research demonstrates that variations in these systems can shift affective tone toward flatness, contributing to chronic feelings of emptiness. Dopamine modulates reward anticipation, serotonin regulates mood stability, and norepinephrine influences arousal and vigilance. Alterations in baseline signaling, whether genetic, environmental, or due to chronic stress, can reduce overall emotional intensity without impairing functional cognition. Functional imaging shows attenuated activation across limbic and striatal networks under low neuromodulatory tone. Importantly, neurochemical influences operate continuously and subtly. Individuals may maintain outward functionality, social engagement, and cognitive performance while experiencing internal voids. Emotional experience becomes muted, temporally stable, and internally sparse. Behavioral studies indicate that neurochemical modulation correlates with reduced responsiveness to rewarding or novel stimuli, flattened affective patterns, and persistent subjective emptiness. The underlying mechanisms reflect baseline shifts rather than acute deficits. Psychology interprets neurochemical-related emptiness as the foundation upon which other cognitive, social, and attentional factors interact. Baseline modulation sets the stage for affective tone, influencing the intensity, differentiation, and salience of all subsequent emotional experiences. It represents a physiological substrate that can predispose the individual to experience internal flatness, integrating seamlessly with cognitive, relational, and environmental mechanisms to shape the multifaceted phenomenon of human emptiness. habitual suppression of curiosity, and cognitive narrowing. Curiosity drives exploration, learning, and the enrichment of emotional experience. Psychological research demonstrates that habitual suppression of curiosity, whether through rigid routines, fear of uncertainty, or overemphasis on efficacy, NCY reduces cognitive breadth and diminishes emotional depth, fostering feelings of emptiness. Neuroscientific studies show that curiosity engages dopaminergic pathways, enhancing reward anticipation and memory encoding. When curiosity is chronically suppressed, neural responsiveness in the ventral striatum and hippocampus declines, leading to reduced motivation and emotional engagement. Experiences continue to be processed, but lack the anticipatory or exploratory salience that normally imbues them with meaning. Importantly, the suppression of curiosity does not impair functionality. Individuals may continue work, social interactions, and routine decision-making effectively, yet their internal experience lacks vibrancy. Novel experiences may feel flat or inconsequential. Behavioral evidence supports this effect. Adults in environments that discourage exploration report lower emotional variability, decreased engagement in creative problem-solving, and persistent internal voids. Even when opportunities for stimulation arise, the subjective impact is diminished due to underutilized motivational circuitry. Psychology frames curiosity-related emptiness as a cognitive narrowing. By prioritizing predictability and efficiency over exploratory engagement, the brain conserves energy at the expense of experiential richness. Internal experience is preserved in continuity, but attenuated in intensity and depth. Social comparison and internal dissonance. Humans evaluate themselves against others as part of adaptive social cognition. Psychological research indicates that chronic upward social comparison, frequent appraisal of oneself as inferior or inadequate, can erode emotional satisfaction and produce persistent emptiness. Neuroscience demonstrates that social comparison activates networks associated with reward and self-referential processing, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and striatum. When comparisons are unfavorable or persistent, these networks generate muted affective responses, blunting the emotional impact of achievements or social interactions. Importantly, social comparison does not eliminate emotional capability. Functional behavior is maintained. Individuals continue to perform and engage, yet internal affective resonance is weakened. Achievements or relational successes may feel hollow in subjective experience. Behavioral studies reveal that individuals with high sensitivity to social comparison report lower self-satisfaction, reduced engagement, and a pervasive sense of internal flatness. Emotional life remains present, but is filtered through evaluative judgments, diminishing affective immediacy. Psychology interprets this phenomenon as internal dissonance. The mind maintains awareness of accomplishments and relationships while simultaneously generating subtle internal contradictions. The resulting emptiness reflects attenuated emotional integration rather than absence of feeling, sleep fragmentation, and emotional inertia. Sleep profoundly shapes emotional regulation. Research in cognitive and affective neuroscience shows that fragmented or poor quality sleep reduces affective responsiveness, producing inertia in emotional experience and contributing to subjective emptiness. During sleep, the brain consolidates emotional memories and restores neural homeostasis. Disruption of REM and slow-wave sleep impairs amygdala prefrontal connectivity, limiting the integration of affective signals and reducing responsiveness to positive and negative stimuli. Consequently, waking emotional life feels flattened or muted. Importantly, sleep fragmentation affects intensity rather than presence. Individuals maintain cognitive function and basic emotional recognition, yet the vividness and nuance of experience are diminished. Even emotionally salient events may provoke muted internal reactions. Behavioral evidence indicates that sleep-deprived individuals report reduced motivation, blunted reward responsiveness, and increased feelings of internal void. Emotional inertia accumulates, creating a persistent, low-variability affective state. Psychology frames sleep-related emptiness as a functional deficit in restorative processing. The mind and brain remain operational, but emotional integration and resonance are compromised, leaving internal experience subdued and internally sparse. Chronic exposure to ambiguity and emotional suppression. Humans rely on predictable frameworks to navigate complex environments. Prolonged exposure to ambiguous or unpredictable contexts can lead to adaptive suppression of emotional engagement, producing persistent feelings of emptiness. Neuroscientific studies indicate that ambiguous contexts increase prefrontal inhibitory control over limbic responses. This minimizes the effective impact of uncertain events, allowing cognitive stability but attenuating emotional experience. Reduced activation in the amygdala and striatum has been observed under chronic uncertainty, reflecting muted salience. Importantly, suppression in this context preserves functionality. Individuals can process information, solve problems, and respond socially. Yet internal affective resonance is reduced. Experiences may be cognitively registered, but lack subjective emotional depth. Behavioral research supports this pattern. People in unpredictable environments report diminished satisfaction, reduced engagement with both positive and negative events, and a persistent sense of internal flatness. Emotional suppression under uncertainty creates a controlled but internally hollow state. Psychology conceptualizes this emptiness as an adaptive equilibrium. Emotional responsiveness is downregulated to maintain stability under conditions of unpredictability, producing a quiet, internally attenuated experiential landscape.